Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Oceanids speaker series. We have 7 lectures a year, and Oceanids is a support group at UC San Diego. And we were founded in 1952 at Scripps Institution of Oceanography, and we have been around ever since, and we support graduate students, undergraduates, and postdocs. We give fellowships and grants. And we also have interest groups for ourselves. So if you're interested in learning more about Oceanids, please go to our website. And if you type in UCSD Oceanids, you will find us easily. And also go to YouTube, where you will find past lectures. And very shortly after this talk, you will be able to find Charlie's lecture online as well. And so now I'm going to introduce our speaker this morning. We are extremely lucky to have Dr. Charles Kennel talking to us this morning. And he is, in fact, combining 2 recent papers that he's in the process of writing. But I'd like to tell you a little bit about Charlie for those of you, particularly who know him as the director of Scripps Institution of Oceanography and might not know really a little bit about his past background, which is so relevant to what he's going to talk to about us today. So Charlie was educated in astronomy and astrophysics at Harvard, and then he did his Ph.D. at Princeton. And then he became professor at UCLA Department of Physics and Institute for Geophysics and Planetary Physics. And he pursued research and teaching in space, plasma physics, and astrophysics. Then he became the department chair, and he also served as the executive vice-chancellor from 1996 to 1998. And while he was at UCLA, he participated in numerous satellite experiments, most notably the Voyager missions to the outer planets. And from 1994 to 96, Dr. Kennel was Associate Administrator of NASA for Mission to Planet Earth. And I think it was his experiences at NASA that converted him to Earth and Earth's climate science. And he's devoted his career ever since to Earth and climate science. And he became the 9th director and dean of Scripps Institution of Oceanography. I'd forgotten you were the 9th, Charlie. And he was also Vice-Chancellor of Marine Sciences at the University of California, San Diego, serving from 1998 to 2006. And he is presently Director and Distinguished Professor Emeritus of the Scripps Institution of Oceanography and a Distinguished Visiting Scholar at the Center for Science and Policy at the University of Cambridge. And I could go on for the whole hour we have talking about his achievements and accomplishments and all the different committees he's served on, all the prizes he's had. But I think if I just tell you that he is a member of the National Academy of Sciences, the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, the American Philosophical Society, and the International Academy of Astronautics, that gives you an idea of what a distinguished scientist Charlie has become. And I don't want to embarrass him any further, so I just want to say there's one thing that is not on his CV. And that is that when I was the director of the Birch Aquarium at Scripps, Charlie was my boss. And he was the best boss you could ever have. And he was a wonderful mentor to me. So with that, thank you, Charlie. And he is going to talk about mind over matter. Please, Charlie, over to you.
Thank you, Nigella. First of all, I want to thank you for the opportunity of being your boss. You came in at a very distressed time for the Birch Aquarium at Scripps, and you've turned it into the vibrant organization that we all know and love. So thank you very much for the kind introduction and also for the privilege of being your boss. It was a great fun working together. Oh. As I understand it, 2 essays were sent out to the membership of this group at different times. One was entitled On Thinking Planets, and the other was Mind Over Matter, which is the more recent one and the one about the current biodiversity crisis. But I'd like to take the opportunity actually to acknowledge my debt to one of my mentors in this field, the great astrophysicist Martin Rees at the University of Cambridge. And I met Martin in 2007 after I stepped down as director and went for the first time to Cambridge. And to give you an idea, Lord Rees was at that time the Master of Trinity College, Cambridge, which is the only college that is a royal appointment. He was appointed by the Queen. He was president of the Royal Society, and he was the Astronomer Royal. And the important thing is, I think he takes the point of view towards the subjects that I will discuss today of an astronomer, in which there are vast regions of space open to the human mind and human investigation, and vast amounts of time in order for events to unravel. And so this is a special point of view that's shared only with paleontologists, that about the workings of time and space, and that this has greatly influenced the kind of work that I did with him. And I used to visit him at least twice a week for long and philosophical discussions, none of which were rigorous, some of which became essays, and all very interesting. Now, the story on Thinking Planet starts with an anecdote about how I held, my wife at the time and I had a dinner for the great physicist Philip Morrison. Morrison was one of the Los Alamos crew, was a division director at Los Alamos under Robert Oppenheimer. And he was well known to us in the physics department as a famous physicist of his era. But he came and introduced a new idea, new to me, in mid-1970s, at the very beginning of the computer networking age. And he opined or guessed that once we connected computers together, at this point that they were experimenting with 2 and 3 networks of 2 and 3, that eventually the network would extend around the world and would connect people and ideas together on a worldwide basis. And this was the beginning of what we now call the artificial intelligence. And he was interested, he took the astrophysics point of view, which I related to Martin. Excuse us for that. So Martin, that Morrison took the astrophysics point of view, and he noticed that eventually the millions of computers around the world would be connected together, and this would be a new kind of thinking organization, and there would be trillions of connections possible between the computers around the world, about as many connections as there are neurons in our brain. And so he speculated that this artificial intelligence had one property that humans do not have. It does not decay biologically. It will fall apart if people fail to service it, but in fact, it's essentially immortal. And so, and for Morrison, the interesting thing was that this thing could live long enough to communicate with other planets like us around the universe. Now, to point out the difficulties, probably the nearest planet to us is further away than several hundred light years. So that means that a back and forth conversation between the two planets would take several hundred years. And no human being has that coherent and enduring a memory. But the machines might. And so the artificial intelligence that is now in his imagination planet-wide would live long enough to carry on a conversation with other intelligent planets, if you will. And that this was the gist of his ideas. Now, when Martin comes into this, the way Martin comes into the story is I related this anecdote to him in one of our conversations. And he said, you know, a lot of what Morrison predicted is actually happening. We have a worldwide internet. We are connecting millions of computers. And so he got very interested in the idea and he thought we ought to write it up. But the essential problem that he saw and that I saw at that time, having just come from Scripps, learned about climate change, learned about biodiversity, was that our civilization, our biological civilization had to live long enough and to get past through an extinction crisis in order to construct the machines that make a thinking planet. And so then we started a whole series of speculations, none of which were rigorous and all of which were interesting, about the question of placing thinking planets in an astronomical context. There were several questions. Would the James Webb Space Telescope discover candidates of thinking planets? You could tell whether a planet has a life on it because you could spectroscopically analyze its atmosphere. And if there are chemicals out of equilibrium in the atmosphere, there's a sign of an active process going along that you would call life. And so the question would be then, are there any thinking planets in our neighborhood with which we could communicate? And then we had another series of questions. Was becoming a thinking planet a natural consequence of evolution? In other words, if you developed organisms that were intelligent, would they eventually develop an artificial intelligence that would be part of their strategy for survival? And so you could ask yourself, to what extent, if you have a planet with organisms on it and one or more of them become, in fact, many organisms have various levels of intelligence. And we, of course, think that elephants are smarter than mice. And so we have already a sense that there are a variety of organisms that are intelligent, but if they develop a society and a language, will they develop artificial intelligence? And will that be a natural outcome of evolution? We had no idea. There's no way to prove the notion, but it was an interesting speculation. But this would have to occur on other planets around the universe in order for us to have a conversation with other civilizations like ours. And so we began to think about the relationship between the development of intelligence and how you would look at and the development of the capacity to communicate over very long distances and long spans of time. So then we began to ask ourselves, well, suppose we had a counterpart someplace in the universe that was looking at us and had its artificial intelligence. It could live long enough to remember all of the changes that Earth has gone through in its evolutionary history. And if it had looked at the last 600 million years of Earth's existence, it would have been in the period of multicellular life. And during that time, it would have observed a planet that went through a number of major environmental transitions. In fact, there would have been periods of punctuated equilibrium punctuated by mass extinctions in which more than 75% of the life was wiped out in a short time between evolutionary eras. The last evolutionary era, and the one that we are living in now, the end of the Cretaceous was caused by a massive asteroid that hit the planet Earth at the Yucatan Peninsula and caused magnitude 9 earthquakes across the Earth, raised vast clouds of gases into the atmosphere through induced volcanism and other things. And there was major climate change, and it wiped out the dinosaurs, but provided a niche for evolution for us mammals to dominate the ecology of the succeeding generation. And so, and if you look back over the 600 million years or so of multicellular life and the more or less billions of years of singular cellular life, you would have seen a planet undergoing our pure civilization would have seen a planet undergoing these changes. But each time there was there were 5 major extinctions in history, in geological history, caused by catastrophic events, much like the most visualizable one is the asteroid impact. There was a period of volcanism when the continent Pangaea split apart and became the major continents that we see now. And there was a period of such intense volcanism and induced climate change that there was again a 95% extinction event at that time. So the planet, it appeared that life was resilient, but its forms were not. And this was part of the story. And the question that we had in our mind, and the one that preoccupies us at the present time, if we look at the present situation, and we look at almost every ecosystem that has been studied by science and rigorously studied by science, we find that there are massive species losses, and they threaten a global extinction that is of at least the geographical scale of the ones that were induced by major geophysical cataclysms in the past. But this time, we understand the cataclysm is us, ourselves, our extractive economies, our exploitive ways of life, our unbridled economic growth, a variety of other things that are causing human society to be responsible for this potential extinction event. And there are people, of course, who have thought about them, including a former Scripps faculty member, Paul Crutzen, who opined about in the year 2000 or so, that the Earth was entering a new evolutionary era, in which, in this case, the human beings would decide the fate of the planet. And that the next extinction cataclysm, by implication, would not be a volcanic explosion or a series of them in Siberia, but would be the collective actions of human beings. So, and we kind of reached the conclusion that what human societies thinks collectively is realized several generations later by what our grandchildren get collectively. So our attitudes matter. And so we continued along that thought. And so that the thinking planet then was an idea that the artificial intelligence that we have developed not only will enable us possibly to think about the conditions under which we will, if we ever do, contact other planetary civilizations, but more importantly, and this is the topic of the second question, we need the artificial intelligence to get through the extinction crisis that we're causing. The complexity of the biological losses, the thousands and thousands of ecosystems on which it is occurring, under the ocean, in the Himalaya mountains, in the deserts, different habitats present such a complex panorama panorama that even it is very unlikely that the human mind, unaided by the precision of our artificial intelligence, will be able to cope with the problem at a global scale. And so we are stuck with both the good and the bad of artificial intelligence. You hear much about the fear, but it is able to, with a kind of precision and a kind of memory that we are unable to marshal as human beings, it is able to actually categorize quantitatively the thousands and thousands of ecosystems behaviors that are important to the continuation of life on Earth. Now, it should be pointed out that there is a very big difference between a mass extinction and a local extinction. A local extinction can be repopulated, if you will, by neighboring ecosystems. Life itself will not disappear, but the forms of life in that particular area will. And a perfect example of that is the great biologist E.O. Wilson, who early in his career cleared a bunch of mangrove islands off the coast of Florida and the Florida Keys and fumigated them and tried to eliminate as much biodiversity as he could. And then he carefully, and with a biologist's eye for precision, documented what returned. And of course, the biota carried by the winds and the waves from neighboring islands managed to repopulate his denuded ecosystems almost immediately. And so an extinction is not irreversible if it's not global. If there's someone around to replenish life, it will replenish itself. But this is not going to happen in the case where where around the world we're beginning to see mass extinctions of species. And we're also experiencing global climate change. And many of the mass extinctions are in one way or another related to the disruptions related to climate change, whether it's due to shifting water availability patterns or pathogen propagation patterns. We're beginning to see that. So the fear is that this extinction is a global one because the human influence is a global one. Now, the question is, will we be able to get through this? And the only answer I can give to that is it's human activities that have caused the extinctions. It is the application or the reverse, the use of human concepts about managing the environment that are related to the current problem. And so if it's causing the problem, it can also cure the problem. But the capacity to cure the problem involves special talent that we're unable to marshal in our own brains or through the agreements of thousands and thousands of experts around the world. We could only slowly marshal the knowledge that takes place, and we cannot keep accurate account of it. But I think with the worldwide computer network and the connections between people and the communications of attitudes, it is possible that we will be able to reorganize our thinking and put our actions where our minds will become. And the specific actions will be detailed, if you will, by the artificial intelligence that we are creating. Now, this is a kind of planetary-wide presence. The present artificial intelligence is collecting computers, information and knowledge from computers around the world. It's a planetary characteristic. So we are in a thinking planet. And so we could use that in order to get through the ecological crisis. And the difficulty is, if you look at the precision of knowledge that is required to understand the propagation of an ecological network, how species A interacts with B, C, D, and E in environmental X, and look at the tremendous amount of labor that is required to put that to quantitative account, it's going to take us a very long time. But I think with an elaborate accounting system, such as the artificial intelligence has, we'll be able to keep track of it. And not only that, but we'll be able to communicate that if there is progress in one region that works, we can communicate the progress around the world adequately, and I think it will make a difference at the global level. We can't have them all the ecosystems declining at the same time. It presents an existential danger. I really think that despite its bad reputation at the present time, AI and the kind of facilities that we think for collective thought that we have created, the artificial facilities may just very well will be what we have to use in order to get out of the existing crisis. Now, and I think that I do not think that this is possible now, but if you look at how much our intelligence, our Earth and biological intelligence has improved over the last 50 years, then we can expect the same kind of improvement, basically qualitatively change, same kind of qualitative change in the next 50 years that we saw in the last 50. Remember that 50 years ago, we had just seen the Earth as a single planet for the first time. Now there's a global view, and we track storms and climate change impacts all over the world. And this will continue, and it will reach a new degree of geographical specificity when we start recounting our adventures with ecologies. Now, this is important. And the reason is that we really don't know what we're doing. We know where we want to go, but we don't know what we're doing. And if you were a scientist and you didn't know what you wanted to, what was happening, you would suggest we're doing experiments. We have to do ecological experiments. We have to try some that won't work out, some that will. And we have to propagate the good news that ones will work out to people who need them. And this is the way that my colleague David Victor has particularly advocated an experimental approach to the managing of the global environmental crisis and climate change, largely because we don't know what we're doing, and that it's necessary to have a number of experiments that we try and pass on the good news and evolve our approach to the solving of the climate and biodiversity crisis problems. Now, ecological experiments, there's a sort of primeval fear that maybe somehow will trigger off a mass pandemic. Suppose, for example, as we will soon be able to do, manipulate the genes of participants in ecological systems. Will we let loose pandemics amongst the organisms, the creatures that we're supposedly caring for? Well, they all live in a specific environment. They live in a specific area, specific niche. And so it's important that you do the experiments on a small scale first. You don't want to do a global experiment. You want to do a whole bunch of small ones that communicate the good news. And you have to use your computer system. You have to use your artificial intelligence. You have to communicate the data. You have to use it to convince other people waiting that are skeptical that you may have something in your back pocket that works. And so I think that the experiments that we do for safety and strategic reasons have to be small scale in individual ecosystems, in which we take extreme care in describing the climatic changes that occur in that region. And documented at a level of local depth and specificity that is still not available even to our geographical mapping exercises. But it will be, if you think about the advances of the next 50 years and the kinds of things that we have seen, it will be available in about 50 years' time or so. I pick 50 years only because the world's population is expected to maximize in about the end of the century, give or take it, and with large geographical exceptions. Many economies and many countries are seeing population decline now. Some are not, and there are various estimates of where the global population will reach a maximum. But sometime around that time, the human footprint on the environment will be the largest, and that is a critical time. And the question is whether we can marshal enough knowledge in the intervening period to work experimentally and save enough ecosystems. As a culturally sensitive point here, because another technical development, we probably will be able to alter the genomes of the species, some of the species that participate in the ecosystems that we're studying. And we'd like to introduce, if you will, environmentally favorable alterations in the genomes and see how they propagate through the ecosystems themselves. Those are the experiments, genetically introducing genetically modified species. But the philosophical implication is, hey, we're intervening in the evolutionary process at the most fundamental genetic level. We did this already with the agricultural revolution. We began to alter the environmental requirements for reproduction, if you will. But now we will be able to do so through genetic modification. Now, philosophically, it's kind of a worrisome principle. If you go around the cultures of the world and say to them, we're about to take charge of our own genetic heritage, how will they look upon this? How do various cultures look upon taking charge of their own future heredity? Will they want to have the same one as the rest of the world? Or will they want to have their own? Or will they want to preserve the look of their landscapes? And all of these cultural questions will become unbelievably important, I think, in the future as the possibility of introducing this capability into a particular region and a particular culture and a particular area becomes obvious, or at least is forced onto people's consciousness by Western science. So I think that that this concept of a thinking planet, which started off as an astronomical speculation, worked out with Martin, actually is, and we realized fairly early on that we would need this capacity to get through the biodiversity crisis. But this concept of a thinking planet, we should think of ourselves as a planet whose process evolved life, then intelligent life, and then social processes involved collective actions that enabled us to predominate. This concept, we have to become a thinking planet. This doesn't mean, and in some sense, we also need to think of ourselves as one planet divided into thousands and thousands and thousands of small systems, each of whom live according to a logic of their own. And I don't see how we can keep track. There's no human mind. We can't reach agreement fast enough in the disciplines to do so, but we may very well, with the aid of modern data processing and artificial intelligence, if you will, use that capacity that our minds have developed in order to deal with the complexity of the issues that we are facing. I could go on, but it'll be repetitive.
Charlie, this is absolutely fascinating and brings up so many questions that I'm sure the audience has a great deal, but I have one I'd like to start off with, and that is, do you have any examples of how people have manipulated ecosystems in small ways?
Well, the one that I liked most was the one that I gave you, the E.O. Wilson's example.
Yes. Yeah. Would you like to just mention that for those who may not remember that?
Well, I mentioned it once, but there were a series of neighboring mangrove islands in the Florida Keys, and he took several of those and tried to eliminate all life on them to see how quickly life would be repopulated and how and where it came from. And of course, the neighboring functioning ecosystem sent messengers in the forms of on the winds and on the waves, and organisms that ended up on these islands and started off the evolutionary process again locally on these islands. And it was from this experiment, amongst other things, that he developed the profound idea that we were going to encounter a bottleneck in that we would lose so many species that are contributing to the evolutionary process and the manipulating our environment to their own ends. We'd lose so many of them that the few remaining ones, there would be a kind of bottleneck of species, and the few remaining ones that remain would be the ones that started off evolution in the next phase. And so whatever we manage to save, or whatever we manage to empower through genetic manipulation, for example, will serve as the basis for the evolutionary process in the very long future. And so that this really means that that the future of life is actually in our hands, and it's entirely possible that we can actually create a beneficial outcome. Most people look at the ongoing extinctions and think that it can't possibly be good. It's all looking bad at the moment, but the idea that we could affect the bottleneck and affect what gets through it, and actually benefit the organisms that survive is probably our path to the future, a path, and the one that's open to our present society.
Thank you very much for clarifying that. I'm sure we have a lot of questions. Who would like to put your hand up if you would like to ask Charlie a question? Adam, if you'd like to unmute yourself, go ahead.
Well, first of all, thank you so much, Charlie. Both these papers present, a really clear idea of, as I'm seeing a kind of a fork in the road. And I understand your idea about using artificial intelligence to help us, in a way, cure the problem of climate change. But I'm curious what you might imagine could be the other part of the fork, in as much as we could evolve and adapt. And if we had to, say, alter the human genome at the germline to live in a different type of climate, is that another alternative?
Sure. Right now, we're at a stage in which many of the decisions are not very clear. They're kind of probabilistic. We know roughly the direction we want to go into, but it's not quite clear what we're going to do. I must say that we've been through this once before. It's called the agricultural revolution, in which we, human beings, changed the landscape in order to feed ourselves. And we reduced biodiversity at the expense of, we increased biomass at the expense of decreasing biodiversity when we cleared the land and started, and I think that in evolutionary biology, for whom 10,000 years is a very, very short period of time, they would look upon that as the first experiment we've had in sustainability.
Any more questions? Who else has a question?
I do.
Judy.
Charlie, thank you so much. It's a very interesting talk. The first thing I got out of it right off the bat was changing my own perspective and trying to think long term more often, because I get so depressed about the day-to-day things going on in the world. It's nice to take a long range view of hundreds of millions of years. But I was intrigued by your comments, your suggestions about running experiments on a global scale to work on our ecosystem problems. And I know of a few of them, but I wondered if you have given this a lot of thought and talked to other colleagues in ecology and biology about some of these, and what some of them are, like acidification of the ocean, or adding iron on a large scale to the ocean, that sort of thing. What were you thinking of?
Yeah, I was thinking largely that the most of the ecological problems are local, or highly specific, and not general. They're not global. They form a global mosaic, if you will, of problems that are occurring in neighboring areas. But I do not think that. And I'm very limited. I'm an astrophysicist. Billions of years accomplished a lot. But I will say one comment. I'm reminded of the saying by the German, I guess, I don't know what you'd call Bert Brecht, but he had a saying about the relationship between the short term and the long term. And the saying was, erst die Fressen und dann die Moral. First we eat, first we feed our faces, and then we worry about morality. And so you cannot continue to exist unless you ensure the daily provisioning of life. Just as simple as that. So sustainability consists of preserving daily viability while you think about the long-term directions. Erst die Fressen und dann die Moral.
I have a question.
Ellen has a question.
I have a question.
Go ahead.
I'll come back in. On the E.O. Wilson experiment, when the regrowth appeared, was it the same as had been there that came from neighboring islands, or was it slightly different because they were not on the same island?
It would have been slightly different because a different assemblage of species started off the ecosystem. But he knew that, and the point was, my point about his point is that you have to know those things in exquisite detail in order to figure out what will happen. You can state the general principle easily, but to know it in exquisite detail is beyond me and probably most of us, including some of the disciplines, especially holding continual awareness of the changing explicit details. And the other thing, of course, is that we do not know whether success, environmental success in one region means environmental success for the globe. And so, and there, I think, capacity of a worldwide thinking system that communicates the results and puts them in a worldwide context, as we are currently seeing in climate change, is, I think, essential. And that is the way that we will decide whether an experiment in Bhutan is actually meaningful for the entire globe.
Well, you just answered my question, Charlie, or commented on what I was thinking about, and that is, for these ecological experiments, and our human brains cannot comprehend the extent of all the different factors that are involved, even in a specific small area. And that's where we're going to rely on AI, because AI can maybe be the channel or the bridge that gets us to be able to understand those kinds of things, and then also understand how something that's changing in Bhutan, something that we're experimenting with in Bhutan, how is it going to affect everybody else? Yeah. Because we think that our experiments are regional and small scale, but we know that, things can get out of control pretty quick. And again, that's where AI is going to come in. And I don't know if I would say save the day. It might save the day, but we're not talking about days. We're talking about epochs. Yeah. And so in that sense, it's a good thing. And I appreciate this conversation. I appreciate hearing what you've presented so much, because like Judy, it gives me a broader perspective on what's happening, and it's engendering hope rather than fear.
That I don't think we get very far without hope.
Yeah.
But hope has to be educated, and you have to believe it.
Yeah, of course. Yeah.
That hope is so important. I think you hit the nail on the head as usual. Wonderful talk, Charlie. Just so much to think about. Always make me think when you have these kind of talks and discussions. I have another question for you, which is, you've dedicated this talk to Martin Rees, and I know who he is because I'm, originally British, but maybe not everybody knows who he is, and so maybe you'd like to tell us a bit more about him and your collaboration with him.
Were it not for the extraordinary life history of Stephen Hawking, Martin would have been hands down in my view, the astronomer of his generation. But Hawking and he were together at the same university at the same time, and Hawking thought very profound thoughts himself. But Martin, when I knew him, I left for Cambridge, my first visit to Cambridge in 2007, after I stepped down as director. And at that time, I'll just repeat, he was the president of the Royal Society, the master of Trinity College, and the Astronomer Royal. But he was very kind to me. I had written a paper in astrophysics in his field that he liked, and this earned an introduction in the 1980s to me when he was in King's College. But by the time he arrived, he was president of the Royal Society, and he performed for me a very great favor. In the month that I arrived at Cambridge, the Royal Society was holding its review of the annual report of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. And they brought together the country's most influential people. And this was 2007. And he invited me to that review. And so therefore, within a month, within a week or so, I got to meet some of the country's leading scientists and became personal friends with them, some of them. And then life became a lot easier in this area for me after that. So it was a very great favor. He sat me next to the founder of IPCC at dinner. And it was just a wonderful introduction.
Well, thank you. That sort of puts it a bit more in context for me. I mean, I knew what he'd done on paper, but it's nice to hear that you think he was such a distinguished astronomer, because Funnily enough, not always people who are astronomer royals are the most, distinguished of the century.
Astronomy was his formal avenue to prominence, but in fact he was a great connector of scientists, and through the Royal Society and elsewhere, and through the college life, he made sure that people who needed to talk with one another actually did, and he and I found the need to talk to one another regularly.
That's wonderful. Are there any more questions for Charlie? Well, I think we're perfect timing. It's just 1 o'clock. So I think with that, we all would like to give you a very big thank you.
And thank you for attending and bearing with me. These